Hey everyone, on today's episode of the SysAdmin Dojo podcast, we've got Carsten Rachfahl, who is a Microsoft MVP based out of Germany. Now last week, Carsten and I did a webinar on Azure Stack HCI. We talked about installation, we talked about networking and storage, we talked about where you might want to use Azure Stack HCI, and is quite common with most of our webinars. We had way more questions than we could answer during the session itself. So we thought what we would do for today's episode of the podcast is we would go through some of the most common questions, give you guys some answers, talk about some of the finer points of those answers, and all of that is coming up next on the SysAdmin Dojo podcast. Well, hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the SysAdmin Dojo podcast, the podcast designed to help you become the kick-ass system administrator within your organization. So as always, my name is Andy Syrewicze, your host, and with me I got a good friend of mine, Carsten Rachfahl. How's it going, my friend?
I'm fine, Andy. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, definitely. You know, it's good having you on the show, the podcast. We just got done doing a webinar last week. Yeah, it was last week. All the weeks blend together after a while. But,
it was Wednesday.
That's right. Not even a week ago, and I've already forgotten what day it was. But anyway, we did a webinar last week on Azure Stack HCI and just hybrid cloud in general, right? And it was, you know, we did two sessions and we had a ton of great feedback, a ton of great questions that came from the attendees of that webinar. And as is quite common with the webinars we do for the dojo, we didn't have enough time to get to all of the questions, right? So I figured we'd do things a little bit differently this time, and a little bit differently for the webinar, and a little bit differently for this podcast as well. So, I mean, we're going to take this episode of the podcast to go through some of these most commonly asked questions about Azure Stack HCI, and it's a little bit different than our usual webinar follow-up. Normally, we just do a follow-up blog post with written content, you know, top to bottom that attendees have to read through. This is the first time we've done like a podcast follow-up to a webinar, so it's kind of a twofer for us here. So, anyway, like I said, we had a ton of great questions, and I figure what we do, Carsten, we just kind of jump right in here to the questions, right? So in the webinar, we talked about what Azure Stack HCI is, who it's for, you know, how to do the installation, networking, storage considerations. I talked about a couple of real-world use cases. I mean, it was a pretty broad webinar, right? Am I missing anything there that you're aware of?
No, I think you're right on, and it's available, right? So if you have a listener who didn't attend, it's still online, I guess. They can watch it.
It is, yes. The webinar is available on demand, so for those of you that are listening or watching, be sure to check the episode description for a link to that webinar on demand. So it will be available for a long, long time, so don't worry about missing out. It will be there when you're ready for it, but certainly check that out. A lot of what we're going to cover in the podcast today pertains to that, but these questions are not webinar specific either, right? If you're looking at Azure Stack HCI and implementing it within your own data center, you know, these questions are applicable to that work, right? So, well, Carsten, with that, I think what we'll do is we'll dive right in. And the first question that I put on the list today is one that I saw repeated time and time again as I was going through. I think we had like 70, 80 questions total from the two sessions. And I saw this
was a lot, yeah.
It was, yeah. And I saw this one come up several times, and it is the kind of people getting up to speed on Azure Stack HCI. And the question is, how can I get up to speed on Azure Stack HCI while spending little to no money? And I think the main driving thing behind that question is the fact that Azure Stack HCI is $10 per core per month, right? To run Azure Stack HCI. So obviously there's a cost there if you're learning about it. So I don't know, what's your recommendation there for how people can train without spending a whole lot of money on it?
Yeah, there are different possibilities. So I think the question is also rooted for Windows Server. If you do storage basis direct, there's always these 180-day free eval version.
Yep.
And with Azure Stack HCI, you don't have that. So one thing is you can do it in virtualization, so you don't need hardware. If you have a hypervisor, so a juicy or big notebook or a desktop, and you have Windows 10 on it or Windows 11, you can enable Hyper-V and deploy some VMs and do everything that you can do with real hardware. And I showed it in the webinar. That was also, some of it was virtual machines, right? Some was real hardware. So you can do that, and there is a 60-day period where you don't have to pay for Azure Stack HCI consumption. So you have a 60-day free period, and after that you have to pay for it. That's the $10 per month. So if you do it in virtualization and you do it for longer than the 60 days, only half the cores are counted if you do hyper-threading. So imagine you have virtual machines with, let's say, 6 cores, and you have 2 of them. That would be 12 cores, so $120 a month. But if you do hyper-threading, you only pay half of it, so $60. And right. There is also an Azure, I don't know if it's a free one, but you can get a 30-day free Azure trial with $150 in it. So that was also a possibility. And the other thing is there is a preview program with Azure Stack HCI. So if you install an Azure Stack HCI cluster, you can join the preview program. So this is of course beta software. It's not production software, and this is free. So even if you have hardware or you want to do it for longer and try some of the new features that will come with the next version of Azure Stack HCI, you can join the free preview program, and then you have an Azure Stack HCI cluster that doesn't cost you any money. You know? It's not the actual thing, it's the next version. It's kind of better. There are of course some errors in there, but you get it for free.
You know, that's actually kind of a smart play by Microsoft in my opinion, right? Because not only are you giving people the option of, you know, testing and getting up to speed on Azure Stack HCI for longer than that initial 60-day window, but from the administrator's perspective, they're getting up to speed on all the latest and greatest features inside the product before they come over to production, right? So that's kind of neat. I liked how they've done that. So very cool.
Yeah.
All right, so that covers the first question. The next one that we have here kind of stems around migration. And the question is, what are my options for migrating existing workloads to Azure Stack HCI? And I'm guessing by existing workloads, they're probably talking about virtual machines, either running on Hyper-V or VMware would be my guess. It's probably the most common scenarios. From my knowledge, I don't think you can just up and live migrate from one cluster to the Azure Stack HCI cluster, can you? That's not an option last I knew.
No, unfortunately, that's not an option because Azure Stack HCI is not Windows Server.
Right.
So we have a different operating system, and there are some reasons why you can't do a live migration, and you can't even do a Hyper-V replica. That's also not possible. So if you look in the Microsoft documentation, they have a scenario where you use a robocopy. So I think you do a pre-copy of your workload, and then you shut it down on Hyper-V and do like a delta. So only the blocks that are missing, I guess. Then I don't know if Altaro has an option here. I know one of your other vendors has an option to do something like that, but I'm guessing an Altaro or a Hornet security webinar. So I guess maybe you have something in your backup solution that you can help the customer here with a short downtime. So can you elaborate on that?
Yes. So our product, Altaro VM Backup, we do have the option of recovering to, I'm going to put recovering in quotations. You know, I'm saying quotations for those that are listening in the car, right? But you can recover to an Azure Stack HCI node. So you could run backups from your Windows Server cluster, right, and then recover them to the Azure Stack HCI node. So that is a supported use case with us. So yeah, definitely that would work. I find it interesting that Microsoft released Azure Stack HCI without like an official migration tool in play, I guess. I mean, Robocopy it's great for what it does, but like, you know, when I think about migrating VMs, I don't think robocopy. You know what I mean?
No, yeah, I'm completely with you. And this was really unexpected, of course. It's Hyper-V in Azure Stack HCI. And one of the great features is live migration between hosts with taking the VM data with you. So the shared nothing live migration. It takes a while, but it's great. And you don't have a downtime.
Right.
And they blocked it somehow. I hope we have MVP Summit the next day, so I hope we learn maybe about something they are planning for migration, but I hope so, because the story is not complete here. We need something, and for a Microsoft customer who is using Hyper-V with cluster maybe or standalone host or even storage bases direct, this is the perfect customer for Azure Stack HCI. Because they know already Hyper-V, so why? I can understand that you can't go from VMware to Hyper-V because there has to be a conversion of the machine. It's not the same, but Hyper-V to Hyper-V. Come on, Microsoft, we need something here. Huh?
Yeah, it's a little strange. That was one of the head-scratching moments for me when they initially announced Azure Stack HCI. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. But yeah, it sounds like today, you either go to the third party or you use the robocopy option. I think they've got that whole process documented out on Docs, don't they? Microsoft Docs, the robocopy option. So for those of you listening or watching, I'll be sure to include a link to that in the show notes as well, just in case you want to take a look at that. So on to our next question. So I've got my Azure Stack HCI instance. I've set it up. I'm using it. And the question here is, can Azure Stack HCI run in a disconnected fashion? Now, as far as I know, it has to check in with Azure at least once every 30 days, I think. Right, Carsten?
That's correct, yeah. So there is no true disconnected scenario. You can't run it on an oil rig without a satellite connection where you once in a while check to Azure. That's because they do the billing of Azure Stack HCI through Azure. It's how you call it, pay-per-used. So you pay for the cores that you use in the month. So you can even deduct your cores, or you can increase your cores, and next month you pay less money or more. So the deduction is maybe weird, but imagine you have a scenario, you have a customer who wants to move 200 VMs from VMware to an Azure Stack HCI scenario. Moving those 200 VMs, of course, takes a lot of time. You have to do planning, and you have even downtime involved, at least if you go from VMware to Hyper-V.
Right.
You can't convert the machines. And there is some software out there, but you have to pay for it, that can do like a near live thingy, live conversion, but it's still with a little downtime. So you have to plan these 200 VMs. So why not start with the hardware, with all the cores you need for the 200 VMs? But then you can go there. Let's imagine you have 4 servers with 24 cores in each. That would be quite an investment. After 60 days, you have to pay 96 cores in the 4 servers. Yeah. So that's nearly $1,000. Yeah. But what if you would say your server, no, I only want to show 8 cores instead of 20, what did I say, 24 or something. Right. So you start with 8 and you only pay for 8. The system has still the cores, but there are servers where you can say in the BIOS, only show 8 and only make 8 available to the operating system. So you can only use of the 24, only 8. So for that, you can deduct it, but still you have to connect to Azure every 30 days at least, so they can bill you over Azure. And if you don't want that, or you can't, maybe you have a scenario where you don't have internet. That's possible. Some places on Earth, there's still no internet.
Right.
So then Azure Stack HCI is not for you. Then I would recommend using Storage Bases Direct. It's still a great solution in Windows Server, and it can be completely disconnected. So your Windows Server doesn't have to talk to the cloud.
Right.
You should patch it, but that you can do offline, bringing the patches to your server and patch it anyway.
Right. And I mean, if I look at again, going back to the webinar, the who Azure Stack is for and what it can do, it kind of makes sense, right? Because, I mean, one of the benefits of Azure Stack are those integrations with Azure, right? And I mean, they probably assume, I mean, the use case obviously is people who are going to be using it in that fashion. So that makes sense. All right. You know, speaking of that,
you're asking tough questions, man. That's not all positive, huh?
right.
But we're not Microsoft. We are MVPs. Okay.
That's right. Well, hopefully the next one might be a little bit of a sticky question too, but hopefully not too bad. So, speaking of the $10 per core per month cost, right? That covers my infrastructure, right, for Azure Stack HCI. Now, the question that I saw come up quite a bit during our conversation last week was, does that $10 per core per month also include guest licensing for any Windows Server VMs I want to run on top of Azure Stack HCI? And the answer is no, if I remember correctly.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately. And I mean, it makes sense, but I just kind of wanted to talk around that particular topic because there's anything with Microsoft licensing, right? It's never a clear-cut, written in a single sentence type of answer. But to my understanding, that's how it does not include any guest licensing, correct?
No, it doesn't. So it's good and it's bad. So I always compare Azure Stack HCI with Storage Spaces Direct in Windows Server. So in Windows Server, if you want to have Storage Spaces Direct, you have to use the data center license.
Right.
And in the data center license, you have Storage Spaces Direct as a feature, but also unlimited virtual server use rights.
Yep.
If you license your cores in the system correctly. So you have to license your cores with data center, and then you can put as many Windows servers on top of it. So that's perfect. In Azure Stack HCI, you don't have that. But now imagine you put not Windows Server on your Storage Spaces Direct, you put Windows Client on it. So as a VDI solution, you still have to pay for the data center license because Storage Spaces Direct is part of the data center license, and you can't leverage the free Windows Server licensing with it, or put Linux machines on top of Storage Spaces Direct, or containers. So if you do, for example, Kubernetes cluster on top of Azure Kubernetes service or another Kubernetes solution on top of it, there are Linux containers in it, and you still have to pay for data center licensing. If we go to Azure Stack HCI, we don't have Windows Server included. So if we want to run Windows Server virtual machines on top of Azure Stack HCI, we have to license the cores. We have to buy those software. But if you put VDI on it, or Linux, or Kubernetes, there are no additional costs for that, except the licensing of, for example, VDI. Right. Linux would be free, and you only pay the $10 per core per month. So in the scenario of Windows Server, Storage Spaces Direct is usually much, much cheaper than Azure Stack HCI, but you get additional features with Azure Stack HCI that are not in Windows Server, and we could talk about that if we have still some time. But if you put VDI on it, you only pay the $10 plus the VDI licensing. In Storage Spaces Direct, you would also pay the VDI licensing in addition to the data center.
Right.
With Windows Server, it seems bad, but the other solutions could be very interesting. Normally, of course, someone who thinks of Microsoft as a virtualization solution thinks of Windows Server.
Right.
That's the usual workload, yeah. But imagine the other workloads could be very interesting. For Windows Server, it's not cheap. It's like look at VMware, vSAN, or Nutanix, or every other HCI solution. You also have to pay additional costs to the Windows Server licensing for the HCI solution.
Right.
Microsoft is a bit in a pickle here because they have a completely free solution for Windows Server with Windows VMs, Storage Spaces Direct, and they have Azure Stack HCI. So here we have a bit of a, how would you say, a disadvantage for Microsoft customers who are used to Storage Spaces Direct or Hyper-V, but all the other things are very interesting. So we have to see what are the workloads of the future. I think Azure Stack HCI is here to stay. And
Yeah.
maybe in the future, we will shift more and more to other workloads than a pure Windows Server.
Yeah,
But you are right. You have to pay additional fees. You have to license Windows Server on top of Azure Stack HCI.
It'd be interesting to see where that goes. Like the VDI piece especially is very enticing because, I mean, historically, VDI has not been cheap in any way, shape, or form. And I'm not saying it'll be cheap in this situation, but it definitely is cost competitive, in my opinion. So,
yeah, and they have a little bit of an advantage in the moment because we talked a bit about Azure Virtual Desktop. That was usually only available in Azure,
right?
And that's still so. So you can't put the Azure Virtual Desktop solution on VMware or on Nutanix or every other HCI solution, but Azure Stack HCI. Because in Microsoft's world, Azure Stack HCI is Azure.
Right.
And Azure Virtual Desktop is available in the moment in the public preview on Azure Stack HCI. And I think if they don't let us pay too much for it, it could be a great scenario because a lot of people in the last 2 years moved to Azure Virtual Desktop because they have the multi-user Windows 10, Windows 11 edition, and that's also possible or available on Azure Stack HCI. So VDI could be a huge workload on Azure Stack HCI.
Definitely. Yeah, that's one of the more interesting use cases, and I'm excited to see where that goes. So, all right, thanks for the info on that, Carsten. So jumping on to our next question here. So this is kind of more of a service provider question, I would say. So, as a service provider, I have a customer base,
I know the
right?
answer, no.
Gotcha.
Anyway.
So often the answer is no, right? So the question is, are you able to host multiple different customers within the same Azure Stack HCI cluster? And it's kind of a it depends question for me.
Yeah.
I mean, I could see you getting fancy with like, software-defined networking to maintain separation of the virtual machine traffic, right? And then, of course, you'd have to be hosting customers that are okay with the commingling of data within the same system, which, depending on your regulation, if you're in a highly regulated environment, which is a no-no, you can't do that, right? So I could see it maybe working for some customers, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so first I have to protect us both. We are not Microsoft licensing experts, so we only share our understanding of the licensing part because that could be getting messy with Microsoft. But as far as I understand, and I'm pretty sure, it's a question often asked by service providers. So they usually have the SPLA licensing, so the service provider license agreement licensing.
Yep.
So they are built for the Windows Server that they offer to customer on a monthly basis. So a customer can say, no, I want the Windows Server. No, now I won't. So it's monthly counted and paid.
Right.
And they want the same with Azure Stack HCI. As far as I know, there is no SPLA licensing available on Azure Stack HCI with one exception. And I wouldn't bet my life on it. It's a German saying, so I wouldn't bet an arm or a leg on it.
Right.
As far as I understand, if the Azure Stack HCI cluster is only for one customer, so you give it to one customer, not multiple customers are on the same hardware. So only one customer. So it's a one-to-one relation. You offer a customer a cluster, then you can do the SPLA licensing. You can't do it if there are multiple virtual machines, like in Azure. You have on the same Azure hypervisor, you have different customers. That's not possible with Azure Stack HCI as of today. I don't know if Microsoft wants to change that. The SPLA license model seems something that is Microsoft not too keen to keep. They want to shift to how it's called, CEP.
The Customer Experience Program, right?
Yeah, it's the Azure licensing, but a lot of service providers love service license.
Yeah.
a service provider license agreement. And I hear these questions all the time. Even our MVP colleagues, we have some MVP colleagues working at service providers, and they want this kind of licensing for Azure Stack HCI. So unfortunately, in the moment, multiple customers, that was the question, right?
Correct.
Multiple customers on the same hardware. As far as I know, it's not possible in the moment. Unfortunately not.
See,
I hear this question all the time.
Yeah, see, I always look at that question from a technical perspective, and I mean, the technology to do it is likely there.
It's not a problem.
But it's a licensing issue, it sounds like.
It's a licensing issue. Exactly.
Yep, definitely. All right, that's good to know. I think we've got time for a couple more questions here. And what's next on my list? This should be a good one. So, would you recommend Azure Stack HCI for a small business? And when I looked at this question, again, I came back to that popular IT answer of, it depends, right? I mean, for me, if the customer really needed to if the customer really needed to stay on premises in some way, shape, or form, and they could take full advantage of all those Azure integrations, for me it would be a yes. But by and large, the last 5 to 10 years, any small business I've talked with about cloud or hybrid cloud, it just made more sense for them to go 100% cloud native, right? But what are your thoughts, Carsten?
So if they want to stay on premises, and there are a lot of customers, I think Azure Stack HCI is easier for a small customer than a bigger one. Because imagine a small customer, how many VMs they have. Let them have 6 or so, or 4. Yeah. So with Azure Stack HCI, you can also license Windows Server with the standard license. So you don't have to have the data center license for every host, because data center is at least 16 cores. So if you have 2 small servers, and there are some great examples in the Azure Stack HCI catalog. So just look in Google for Azure Stack HCI catalog, and there you find some microservers, 2 servers, very small. They look like a backup device, like a QNAP or a Synology. You have 2 of those boxes, and they have maybe 8 cores in each. So for $160 per month, you get your Azure Stack HCI solution with all the benefits. So updates, new features every year, and so on. Even if you have old versions of Windows, you have the ESU, so extended security updates. So there are some great features in Azure Stack HCI, and you don't have to license data center. So if you compare it with Storage Spaces Direct, you have at least to buy 2 times 16 cores for each server, 16 cores, even if there are only 8 cores in there. Windows Server, at least 16 cores. So we're talking maybe $8,000 without software assurance. And you can have a lot of months for $160 plus some Windows standard licenses. So if you have 4 VMs, you license 2 standard licenses to every node, so 4 of them, and you would be maybe, I don't know how the exact price is in the US, but let's say 3,000, maybe 4,000. So you have still some room to use your Azure Stack HCI, and you get all the great benefits. So I think for a small customer, it's more easy if they don't have too much VMs. More easy to choose Azure Stack HCI than Storage Spaces Direct. And of course, there are other solutions.
I think that's a good observation, and I think what stuck with me from when you were talking was the extended security updates. So I found in my travels that your SMB is quite often more likely, at least here in the States, to be the company that is holding on to that old legacy server because it's cost prohibitive to upgrade it. Maybe it's running some proprietary piece of software. I see that a lot in the manufacturing space. Like, in order to upgrade this manufacturing machine, it's going to cost like $250,000 or something like that. So they keep it on an older version of the OS. So that extended security updates in Azure Stack HCI, for people that are still running 2008 R2, that could be really enticing too. So I think that's That's interesting.
And they don't have the specialized IT guy. Usually, if you have a small company, someone is doing IT in addition to his normal job, right?
Yeah.
So they are not so specialized to maybe upgrade from Windows Server 2008 to, let's say, Windows Server 2019 or 2022 and so on. So maybe especially the extended security updates is a good solution. And there are more operating systems falling out of support. We have 2012 and 2012 R2 next year. So I think that's also a good sales point for Azure Stack HCI.
Interesting.
That is beneficial, not only Microsoft earning money, but they give us something that I don't know any small customer who affords the extended security updates. It's only for huge customers, and it's quite expensive.
Yep,
so
definitely.
They won't get it otherwise.
Right.
They won't buy it.
Who knows? Maybe someday we'll see a Azure Stack HCI SBS edition. I'm not holding my breath on that one.
Microsoft will ever do that again.
No, I'm not holding. I'm not holding my breath on that one. It's just funny to think about, right? Yeah. All right. So what do we got next here? Yeah, this one we touched on in one of our early questions in the show, and that centers around Hyper-V Replica and whether or not it's supported with Azure Stack HCI, and it's not, right? So
it's a no. Unfortunately, it's a no.
As a longtime Hyper-V guy, it's hard for me sometimes because it's like I know it's there, and it's like I want to use it, but we should have our good friend Ben Armstrong on the line again at some point to ask these questions because it'd be interesting to find out what the behind the scenes conversations that led to that decision are. I'm always curious about those things. Yeah. So here is another one, and I suspect this is going to be the same answer that we had around the migration question, and that is it possible to upgrade an existing Windows Server cluster to Azure Stack HCI? And I believe the answer is no, because it's a different OS.
It's true. It's no. There's always a way you can work around it. So it depends on how many hosts you have. So if you have maybe a 4-node cluster with the right resiliency, it would be enough if only 2 nodes are working. So you could install, there's no upgrade, but you could install a fresh Azure Stack HCI on 1 node. So first you get 1 node out of your cluster, you pause it, you move all your VMs, then you set up a new Azure Stack HCI node. Then you have to move offline some VMs from your 3-node cluster to the 1. Yeah, you can always set up a 1-node machine, but with Azure Stack HCI and with the storage spaces direct part, I'm not sure if we could go from 1 node to 2 node with the resiliency. So maybe not a good idea. So you had to get out 2 nodes. Then if something happens with the remaining 2 nodes, you are done. So unfortunately, I can't imagine a solution unless you use Altaro backup and back up your VMs, set up the cluster, restore everything, and you maybe have a downtime of a weekend or so. But there's no upgrade path from Windows Server to Azure Stack HCI.
Right.
As far as of now, and I don't think they will change that.
Right. Yeah, that'll be a spot to watch. But yeah, like you said, I don't imagine that's going to change anytime soon just because they're such different animals, right? Yeah. So, all right. Another interesting question here. Can you mix different versions of Azure Stack HCI in the same cluster? So like, 20H2 with 21H1. To my knowledge, yeah, you can. There's probably some question around best practice behind that, right?
Yeah, there is an upgrade path. So with Azure Stack HCI, you have these weird numbers, like we said already, 20H2, 21H2. The next version will be 22H2. Right. So that's always the year and the part of the year. So 21H2 is the actual version. So it's the 2021 version, the year, and the second half year.
Right.
So we will get the next version, I guess, around October this year. So it will be 22H2. And there is a possibility to upgrade from 21H2 to 22H2. You can do it while the cluster is running. You move your VMs. You have an in-place upgrade, and it's orchestrated. So, and you have to do that because Microsoft only supports the old version after a new version comes out 6 months. So at the 19th of April, the support of 20 H2, the older version, will end. So 6 months after the new version comes out. There are reasons for that because you get a good, let's say a very good support over Azure from Microsoft, and it's not too expensive, and it's a good one. So for $100 or $1,000, it's depending on you. $100 would be fine. A month you get a good support, really good support. I had contact with the support, at least in Europe. And they can't support you if you imagine you call them in 24. And they first have to check, do you have 20 H2, 21 H2, 22 H2, 23 H2, or are you on the actual version 24 H2?
Right.
And then which one knows all the differences and the problems? So they say we only support Azure Stack HCI 6 months after the new release comes out. You have to be on the new release. Yeah?
Yep. That
so
makes sense.
There is a time when you can use a mixed cluster, but it's not recommended. So only for the upgrade of all the nodes, it is a mixed cluster. Then it should be all the same.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. And then just to wrap up with one more question here, and I can speak to this one a little bit. And the question is, can you install Azure Stack HCI on uncertified hardware for testing purposes? The key bit there, for testing purposes, right?
Testing purposes, yeah.
And I will say from my own experience, I have a couple of Supermicro white boxes in my basement that I was able to install Azure Stack HCI on. It is in no way, shape, or form supported by the hardware vendor or Microsoft, but it does work. So I'm using some really old now, but some old ConnectX-3, Mellanox ConnectX-3 adapters, and it does work, but I would certainly never run it that way in production. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Carsten.
Yeah, I had from a good friend of mine, I got two Dell 7020 hosts. So they are at least they were machines that were 7 to 8 years old.
Right.
But a lot of memory in there and 2 8-core processors. So perfectly fine. So I bought two SAS controllers because Azure Stack HCI, no RAID, only for the operating system, but the storage has to be connected to a SAS or in some exceptions SATA. And I put it in there and it worked very well with Azure Stack HCI, but there is no support. So the 720s, I don't even know if they are supported in 2019.
Right.
So with Windows Server 2019, but it worked. So I put 2022 on it, worked. And if 2022 works, Azure Stack HCI, even 21 H2 works.
Yeah.
So, but no support, you're right. For testing purposes, I would say it's okay. But if you have a problem, don't say it's Azure Stack HCI. Maybe it's the drivers or the firmware and everything. But it works. For playing around, you can do that. And another option to play around is really the virtual machine thing. You can do everything you do on hardware with Azure Stack HCI. You can do in Hyper-V virtual machines. Hyper-V has nested virtualization for 6 years now.
Yeah.
So you can perfectly host Hyper-V and Hyper-V, and you attach some virtual disks there, and you are golden. You can even install Kubernetes in it, or Azure Virtual Desktop. My first test was Azure Virtual Desktop in nested Azure Stack HCI, so no problem at all.
Sounds like we got lots of options there, and good to know that it does work on uncertified hardware for those testing scenarios, right? So,
yeah.
Well, Carsten, I think that wraps up for our questions.
Yeah,
here.
Let me do one shout out. So if the people want to test Azure Stack HCI, a friend of mine, you maybe heard of him, Jaromír Kaspar from Czech Republic. He has done all the VS Lab, and now it's called MS Lab. I don't know if you know that. It's a PowerShell script. It's on GitHub. It's completely free. So he was in Microsoft PFE, and he's now working for another vendor. But he said, I want to learn all this stuff, and he started to scripting all the things. So there are really cool scenarios where you can build up, even on a small notebook. He started with a Surface with 16 gigabytes of RAM and one SSD, and he has scripts where you can set up an Azure Stack HCI cluster. You spin it up automatically. You can do Grafana with S2D, with Azure Stack HCI,
nice.
everything. So search for MS Lab on GitHub. And for the people who wants to start with different scenarios, you have to learn a bit. There are some videos included, how you started. You have to do some imaging, like from an ISO image. He has even scripts for that you get your template from Azure Stack HCI, Windows, and everything. But it's really cool to do labs with it, and it's quite easy. So you don't have to buy hardware. You can start with virtualization, and
nice.
If you like it, buy hardware and go on.
Nice. Yeah, for those of you listening and watching, I'll be sure to get that link in the show notes as well, because I'm interested in that myself, right? So I never know when I'm going to need a virtualized Azure Stack HCI cluster for a demo or a lab or something. So definitely I'll take a look at that myself. So, well, Carsten, I appreciate you taking the time to come and talk with us today. You know, it's always fun talking to you about Azure Stack HCI and answering these questions. So really appreciate you coming out, my friend. For those of you watching or listening, be sure to check out the Altero Dojo for further educational content. We've got a number of different sections on lots of different stuff. It's getting easier to say what we don't cover than what we do cover these days. So we've got M365 material, VMware, Hyper-V, Azure, MSP specific material, backup and DR, lots and lots and lots. You can check that out by going to altero.com/dojo and just pick your poison and go from there. Other than that, be sure to stay tuned for another episode of the SysAdmin Dojo podcast coming at you next week. And in the meantime, have a good day, and we'll talk to you again soon. Thanks for watching. Hey everyone, it's Andy again. Hey, thanks for watching the episode today. Hope you enjoyed it. One thing I wanted to leave you with, we've been talking a lot about Azure Stack HCI, Hyper-V, hybrid cloud, and a lot of the recent episodes. Wanted to let you know that on March 23rd, we are running a webinar that talks about all things Azure Stack HCI and hybrid cloud. Now, you can register for that webinar by clicking on the link in the description of this episode. And if you're watching or listening to this episode after March 23rd, you can use that same link to watch the webinar on demand. So hope you enjoy it. Again, we hope to see you for a future episode of the podcast. Have a great day.